Hello everybody, and welcome back to Quest for Truth. Today we're beginning a new series looking at the Ten Commandments. Now before we get into looking at the commandments themselves for the next few weeks, we have to consider about what this law is. Now, it is a moral law, or what's also known as natural law. It's given by God, and it's because we are created in His image that we're responsible to Him to keep this law. And this law is greater than, any laws given by governments, and demands our obedience to Him. In fact, government laws are subservient, really, to natural law. If we think about the Holocaust, and after the Holocaust, the Nuremberg trial was predicated on natural law because the Germans were following German law, but they were breaking something more, a higher law, which is this law that is given by God, that we are responsible to keep. Now, what I want to be careful of doing is I don't want to push a moralistic idea here. I don't want you to think that that's what we're doing. See, moralism says that obedience to the law is more important than a relationship with Christ. It pushes the obedience to the law without Jesus. And that's not what we're doing at all. In fact, when you look at Exodus chapter 20, where the Ten Commandments are first found, it starts off by saying this: "Then God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." So these laws are predicated on who God is and who we are. Now, so then knowing God is primary to keeping these laws. We have to know Him before we can think about keeping these laws. So we should not push the laws over knowing God. We should push the laws within knowing God. When we know God, we can then keep these laws. But so now we want to look a little bit into why these laws were given, and are they still relevant to us today? Because many would say that they're not. That the Old Testament laws are, they're fulfilled by Christ, and we no longer have to concern ourselves with them. So let's take a look. I think there's two reasons that we can point to that these laws were given. The first of which is to show us our sin. We see in Romans 3, Paul talks about the law that brings forth knowledge of sin. Through the law, we see our inability to meet God's perfect standard. And when we can't meet that standard, we are made aware that there needs to be another way for us to be able to have a relationship with Him. And that was provided by God first through animal sacrifice in the Old Testament, and then through the coming of Christ and the sacrifice on the cross of Jesus, the Son of God. And that's the gospel. That's the law shows us our sin so that we see we need God. And then God provided a way of forgiveness, so that even though we cannot keep the law, we still have a way of being of being forgiven and able to be with him. Now, that being said, the law is not for personal achievement of righteousness. Like I said, we can't keep the law, so it is not how we gain righteousness. We're not made righteous through keeping the law, because to break one aspect of the law is to break the entire law. It is rather through Christ that we're made righteous, when we're being made righteous. But now that I said that we can't keep the law, the other reason that we're given the law is really to be kept. God didn't give us this law and say, oh, well, don't keep the law. No, it was given so that it would be kept. And yet we can't keep it. But even, Paul in Romans says, through when sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. So then he poses the question, should we continue to sin so that grace can abound? And the answer is absolutely not. We shouldn't continue to sin so that grace could abound. Now, of course, like I said before, we're not perfect and we don't achieve righteousness through the laws, but we are called to obey God, and walking in obedience with him means to keep the law. And really, when we think about being like Christ, we often think that way of, well, we want to be more like Christ. Well, what does it mean to be more like Christ? It means to be really perfect. And how do we be more like that? It's to keep these commandments that God gave us. They are the measure of righteousness, essentially, of how you be more like him is to obey God and to follow his law. But he doesn't leave us, alone in this, in trying to follow the law. 1 Timothy 1:7 says, "For God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline." He enables us to keep his law. He gives us power to keep it. He gives us love, which is a large part of the law. When Jesus was asked what is the most important commandment, he said that basically, to sum up the law, is to say to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, soul, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And you notice the difference there. I've always found that interesting, of loving God with your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength, all of those things. And we could really say that means to love God with the entirety of our being, but it's broken down really so that we can see it's not just loving God, but it's loving God with our physicality, with our mental, with our emotions, in our soul. It's very a multifaceted idea of loving God with every single bit of every part of our being, completely and wholly loving God, which is, something that I don't think we attain to in this life, but it's something that we should be striving towards. And then the second, like he said, the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Now he assumes that you do love yourself, which we do, of course, love ourselves. We don't always do it in the best way or the right way, but when we're hungry, we eat. When we're thirsty, we drink. When we're in danger, we try to escape that danger. And again, that can come out in many different ways, in ways that don't seem like love to people who actually know what love is. It can be twisted, and it can include, harming yourself because you have come up with the idea that that somehow makes your life bearable or better in some way. So in a twisted way, you really are loving yourself, even in those times that doesn't look like you're loving yourself. And so we're to love our neighbor with the love we would have for ourselves, to always be there for them, to give them help when they need it, and to when they're hungry, give them something to eat. When they're thirsty, give them something to drink. And that is, how we love our neighbor as ourselves. And as we go through this series, we're going to look through these different laws. The first 4 really have to do with how we love God with everything that we are, with all of our soul, strength, mind, and to love our neighbor. That's the last 6 are really about how do we love our neighbors like we love ourselves, and to treat them as who they are, as being made in the image of God, being fellow image bearers. And so now we've talked a lot about keeping the law, but it's a struggle. It's, even as Christians, like I said, we can't keep all the law, and yet we struggle to do so. And that struggle to keep the law is really based on the desire to want to keep the law. When we desire to keep the law, we struggle, we strive to do it. Even though we fail again and again, we try to. And that's why struggling is a good thing. When we want to leave this flesh behind and to walk in perfect harmony with God, we're going to struggle. We're going to face setbacks, and we're not going to, live up to that ultimate goal of being perfect until we are made perfect by God. And yet we want to do so. We desire to. We struggle forward to be who we're made to be, and to walk in perfect harmony with Him. So that's why, why we should keep the 10 Commandments, and why we should know them. So join us again next week as we really dive into this study, and we begin to look at the first commandment, what it means to have no other gods before the one true God. And I'll see you next week. Okay.